So far, we've been looking at the historical atom, and as we've looked through this, we've covered pretty much every academic discipline you can imagine. We did biblical studies, and we looked at the biblical data for the historical atom, that Jesus believed it, Paul believed it. We looked at evidence for being made in the image of God. This took us into primatology, animal psychology, philosophy, near-death experiences, just about everything there. Then we looked at genomics and fossils, paleoanthropology, the scientific plausibility that this could even be true. Tonight, we try and weave all of this together in such a way that we try and come up with multiple models for who Adam was. So let's begin here. When we look at an evolutionary timeline, the last common ancestor, which you can see there up on the left, this is the last ancestor between us and who? Well, the great apes, the chimps, the bonobos, gorillas, and so forth. But that common ancestor diverged into chimps, bonobos, and gorillas. So I keep repeating this, but it bears repeating. We didn't evolve from monkeys. We evolved from a last common ancestor who we don't know. We don't know this common ancestor in the past. But from some point 7 to 10 million years ago, we evolved from this last unknown common ancestor, and this split off again into Australopithecines. The genus Australopithecus, as we studied last week, is the bridge between us and this last common ancestor, which brings us to the genus Homo. The genus Homo. Homo is Latin for man. Pilate said, Ecce Homo, behold the man. So now, from an evolutionary paradigm, that is the picture. Where on this paradigm would we place an intervention of God to create the first original humans? Well, let's begin with the first in the Homo genus. Remember, we saw that there was a huge gap in the fossil record between Australopithecines and the genus Homo. So I think we're in safe territory to say that we should begin with the genus Homo, which means that we need to begin with Homo habilis. Homo habilis is, again, Homo Latin for man, and habilis, think of habitat, handyman. He used tools. When did he live? Somewhere between 2.8 million years ago and 1.7 million years ago is the approximate dates for Homo habilis. His brain size was 600 cubic centimeters. You say, why do I care? Well, we're trying to discern, is this human? Well, it has Homo at the beginning of the designation for the species. Yes, that's the name that's attributed to Homo habilis. But is this human, an image bearer of God? The cranium of Homo habilis is 600 cubic centimeters. Modern or ancient humans, the cranium size is 1,400 cubic centimeters. Modern humans, it goes anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 cubic centimeters. So very, very small brain. And this has led many anthropologists to say that actually this should be classified as Australopithecus habilis. Australopithecus habilis, not Homo habilis. That this species is in the wrong genus. This shouldn't be classified in Homo at all. That they were, quote, more ape-like than Lucy. Lucy was discovered by Donald Johanson and was an Australopithecine, and Homo habilis is more ape-like than Lucy. So Homo habilis, in the idea of being in the human species, really stretches the credulity. Is there evidence of this? Well, they used tools, early stone tools. Like what kind of tools? Well, Oldowan tools. What does that mean? Oldowan tools are basically rocks. And they've been broken in certain shapes and snapped so that you can use them to cut, to smash, and so forth. But William Lane Craig points out this. He says, the manufacture and use of Oldowan stone tools has been taught to chimps in captivity. Could this be Adam? Not a chance. I'm pretty firm on this. That is outside of the human race. Now, let me make a quick digression. I'm going to keep saying human. And you're going to say, but we're studying all these different hominins. And why don't we just say Homo sapiens are the first humans? Well, because these are artificial designations. We're saying, what is a human? Made in the image of God, capable of symbolic thought, abstract reasoning, able to use complex tools and language and that sort of thing. So philosophically, you need a being with volition, which is a will. You need abstract thinking and all those kind of things. And it's not just a person, but a human person. So if Klingons come from outer space, they could be persons, but they aren't human persons. Or angels, demons, they are also persons, but they aren't human persons. So what we're trying to do is look at these different species and say, do they have the marks of being truly human, made in the image of God? Homo habilis? No. I'm going to say no, no, and no. All right. What about Homo erectus? You could probably figure out the Latin on this. Homo meaning man, erectus meaning upright. If we look at our evolutionary timeline, they come in at about 1.9 million years. They would be after Homo habilis. And there's a subspecies referred to as Homo ergaster. Homo ergaster. This is not supposed to be classified as a different species. This is a subspecies within Homo erectus. So a famous skeleton of Homo ergaster is the so-called Turkana boy. 90% of this fossil remains today. This is from 1.8 million years ago. This was an extraordinary find. So you say, well, that's a separate species from Homo erectus. It's Homo ergaster. No. Anthropologists like Ian Tattersall refer to Homo ergaster as African Homo erectus, or Homo erectus ergaster. Remember we discussed briefly, there's the idea in anthropology between the lumpers and the splitters. When you look at two different hominins, are we splitting and trying to say that those are two different species, or do we lump them together and say, no, those are the same species? This would be one of those instances of that debate. Are you a lumper where you say ergaster and erectus are the same, or are you a splitter where you say that they're different? For the sake of everyone's sanity, we're going to be lumpers tonight because there's really no significant distinction between the two. Now, if we put this on a timeline here, Homo erectus actually goes from 1.9 million years ago all the way to about 100,000 years ago. And they began here in Africa, and they spread pretty far, all the way up into Europe, into India, all the way down into Indonesia. That's how far Homo erectus has spread, and the fossils are just everywhere. I mean, very, very far. 1.8 million years ago, 1.9, all the way to roughly 100,000 years ago. What about the brain size? 600, not that good, all the way up to 1,000 cubic centimeters. That would be on the very baseline threshold of human. Humans are anywhere from 1,000 up to 2,000 cubic centimeters, averaging in at about 1,400. So Homo erectus would barely make the cut. If it was kindergarten, the humans would go over with the blue jays, and Homo erectus would go with the red robins. And they would be like, why are we in this group? And they'd be like, no big deal, just go with that group. Everyone awkwardly laughed. They're like, I was with the red robins. All right, well, no judgment. All right, physical size, somewhere between 5'3" and 6 foot tall. Homo erectus. They stood up, they walked. And they weighed in anywhere from 88 to 150 pounds. You might say, well, that's really skinny. Most people were this skinny We live in America in the 21st century. We're the weird ones historically. Going back when you had to scavenge for your food and you're using all of this caloric energy just to get the next amount of calories, you were pretty skinny on the verge of starvation. Do they bear the hallmarks of being made in the image of God? Well, they have cooperative hunting, ? We've found at these sites that Homo erectus used these tools that are referred to as Acheulean tools. More on that in a minute. And they butchered different big game animals. Now, some people have interpreted that to mean that they hunted those big game animals. And other people have interpreted it to mean they waited until they died and then they sliced them open, butchered them, and then ate the meat. Which is true. If it's cooperative hunting, that would mean that that is showing language of some sort, being able to work together, that you're able to know how to coordinate and that sort of thing. On the other hand, many animals do cooperative hunting. And this could be a scavenger, like a jackal. A jackal doesn't really kill. Jackals go and they eat things that already are killed. All right. Another sign of being made in the image of God is that they were capable of survival in various different regions. As we saw, they had a really big geographical spread. They were able to make it into multiple different regions. Of course, they did have roughly 2 million years to do this. But that shows some level of intelligence and being able to move outside of Africa. They use these tools referred to as Acheulean tools. Acheulean tools. The argument that this is referring to a person is that they were able to do work on these tools that showed symmetry, that they could hack away a part of the stone and then do the same on the other side, flip it, hack away at the stone, other side, and they could use these to hunt, kill, fight, war, battle, etc. Again, did they take down big game with these little knives? Is that what we're to believe? They don't have any kind of what they call composite tools, where they're able to hook up one of these different spearheads to a spear, or one of these different axe heads to an axe, where they could come in and axe something or throw a spear. All they had were these primitive Acheulean tools. Homo erectus. Could this be Adam? Well, I'll give you the pluses and the minuses, the positives and the negatives, the pros and the cons. The pro for thinking that Homo erectus was Adam is that you would have virtually no issue with the scientific record whatsoever. I mean, you would have issues with, we're similar to chimps in our DNA, 95%. What about the junk DNA? But we've already looked through that. So on the basis of where we're moving at here, the gap between Australopithecus and the genus Homo is huge. In the fossil record, here you have a species in the genus Homo, a hominin that is able to walk upright, use tools to slice open animals, maybe cooperatively hunt, and so forth. Negatives. That is very scanty evidence to say that this is a being made in the image and likeness of God. And they existed for over, 1.8 million years? And all they could show for it were these simple Acheulean tools. Something that, we could see in the animal kingdom. Maybe not that much. Maybe I'm exaggerating. But to say that we've got a simple spearhead, and that is all the advancement we got in nearly 2 million years. Boy, I would like to see some better evidence than that. Another negative would be, how far can we push the gaps in these genealogies in Genesis 5 and in Genesis 10? Now, I've already argued that there are gaps in the genealogies, that biblical genealogies are not chronologies. They're not there to show time. That being said, can we push it 1.9 million years? That there was 1.9 million years. And if Adam goes back to 1.9 million years, we're saying that there was no language, that there was no writing, I mean, we run into very, very serious difficulties. Now, I'm going to argue throughout this that that's going to be a problem for any view I give. We don't get writing until the Sumerians in about 5000 BC. And we don't have, agriculture and animal husbandry and all that kind of stuff until the Neolithic period. When is that? Neo meaning new, lithos in Greek meaning stone. New Stone Age, after the last Ice Age, 10,000 years ago. So if you're holding out for Adam being in the Neolithic, you're going to have a ton of problems. The antiquity of Adam doesn't mean nearly as much to me as fitting him into an entire paradigm, scientifically, biblically, archaeologically, and so forth. So I do think there's gaps, but to stretch it 1.9 million years, that would be a negative of this view. And again, Genesis 4 describes that so-and-so was the father of the lyre, the musical instrument, and so was the father of shepherding. And so, all right, that's all in the Neolithic period. That's 10,000 years ago. I guess we should get this out of the way. What does it mean if Adam and his descendants are described as being in the Neolithic period? The word father, the Jabal, is the father of musical instruments. Does that mean that he's the one who invented them? Or does it mean in the Hebraic train of thought that he's the one who brought forth this entire enterprise, that it was from his lineage that musical instruments began? Or that so-and-so is the father of shepherding, or so-and-so is the father of metallurgy? Does it mean that he was the first one to create iron? Or does it mean that he was the progenitor, he was the one from whom metallurgy arose? That seems to be plausible, and we know that there's gaps in the genealogy. The question is, how comfortable do you feel pushing those gaps? I'm going to leave it there. You might be like, so what's the answer? I'm going to leave it there. How comfortable do you feel pushing those gaps? Is putting Adam in the Neolithic that important to you? Or do you think that we could push these gaps pretty far? I think we can push them very far. 1.9 million years? I just don't know. That's difficult. Well, let's keep going. Homo heidelbergensis. Homo heidelbergensis. He gets his name from being discovered in Heidelberg, Germany. He falls on the line around 600,000 years ago after Homo erectus. I'm skipping over some kind of offshoots that really aren't germane to our discussion, certain hominins that existed. But Homo heidelbergensis comes on the scene about 600,000 years ago, and again, out of Africa, and spreads really far, all the way up into Europe, into India, and into East Asia. So, could Homo heidelbergensis be Adam? Let's look at him from William Lane Craig's perspective. This is his view. Adam is Homo heidelbergensis. He writes this: Adam may be plausibly identified as a member of heidelbergensis, living perhaps 750,000 years ago. So Craig actually puts this even further back than I would, but what's 150,000 years between friends, right? Okay, so he puts it all the way back to 750K. He could even have lived in the Near East in the biblical site of the Garden of Eden. Remember, he's in Africa. There's bones there. Though vastly earlier than usually thought, of course. Yes, on the order of 750,000 years. His descendants migrated southward into Africa, where they gave rise to Homo sapiens, and then westward into Europe, where they evolved into Neanderthals and Denisovans. Let me get this out of the way. We're not going to study Denisovans. We are going to study Neanderthals. Why aren't we going to study Denisovans? Because we don't know a lot about them. We have the genome of Denisovans sequenced from ancient DNA. But they went into the Denisova cave. They found a bunch of bones. Most of them were Neanderthal. But they found a little pinky bone and a couple of molars. And they drilled into it and found that this was a different genome from both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. This was discovered in the last decade. This is very, very fresh. However, we don't have any fossil remains of the Denisovans. So when you hear this talked about, it's Homo heidelbergensis, splits off into Homo sapiens, and then into Neanderthals, and also into Denisovans. They went further east into Malaysia, and they get all this from the genetic signatures. That's about what we know. Beyond that, look up Wikipedia. All right. Homo heidelbergensis dates somewhere between 600 to 450,000 years ago. The brain size comparable to humans. This is what got Craig's attention. If humans have a cranial capacity of 1,400 cubic centimeters, Homo heidelbergensis has anywhere from 1,100 to 1,400 cubic centimeters. The size, again, short, skinny, but again, most people in history would fit this human profile. Somewhere between 4'9" and nearly 6 foot tall. I mean, even the Israelites, on average, were 5.5 feet. That's about it. Most of our, grandparents, great-grandparents, they didn't get that tall. Nutrition, all these other reasons. However, Homo heidelbergensis would fit both with the cranial capacity, not the shape and morphology of the brain, but the capacity, the raw volume, and Homo heidelbergensis would fit with the size of modern humans. Is there evidence that this species is made in the image of God? We have several different lines of evidence that Craig really likes. He's the one that's really pushed this, and it's very interesting. For one, we've got an Acheulean axe. So remember the Acheulean tools, those are the ones that are carved, that they're split on both sides. So you've got a spearhead, but it's a composite tool. It's tied and wrapped around an axe head. So they not only had the axe, but they got the handle. This dates all the way back to 800,000 years ago, an Acheulean hand axe. They used pointed projectiles for hunting. They used hafting, as I said, composite tools. Hafting just means that it's, I'm going to make a bad association. Hopefully this is a good mnemonic. It's half of the weapon. It's half of the tool. So that's not what the word means, but hafting. So you got the head of the spear and you've got the spear. You've got the head of the axe and you've got the axe. Homo heidelbergensis was able to use hafting when they created their tools, weapons, etc. That's pretty good, to be able to use compound tools in thinking. They used grindstones to grind up their meals and the wheat and so forth. Craig is very impressed with the studies of their domestic spaces, where you go in and you look at how things are purposely planned. He sees a lot of symbolic thought in their dwellings. Most important evidence, the best evidence, would be the Schoengen spears. The Schoengen spears. These were found in Germany, and these spears, according to Craig, are the best evidence that Homo heidelbergensis was made in the image of God. These things are incredible. Up until this point, we do have good evidence. We do have good evidence for Homo heidelbergensis. However, let me just be a skeptic for a moment. Pointed projectiles for hunting. Chimps do this. Chimps do this. They tear off parts of wood with their teeth. They use projectiles and spears. They can create spears. Hafting and composite tools, it depends how much you want to place on that. Do you think that that is being made in the image of God, or do you think that that is just something special to that species? That, yeah, they did have intelligence, but does that really bring you to the idea of abstract thinking, symbolism, language, all the things that we would associate with the image of God? All right, the Schoengen spears. Craig says this. He says, reproductions of the Schoengen spears have been made, and they turn out to be on par with Olympic javelins. They found 3 of these amongst a bunch of other tools and stuff in Germany. 3 of these spears were found made out of spruce, a really hard wood, and they were carved either out of the trunk of a tree or a branch, not that clear. But he says that they were so perfectly made, that they're on par with an Olympic javelin. So, to what degree? He says, well, first of all, they're 6 or 7 feet in length. They're 500 grams in weight, about half a pound. An athlete with a modern range of 800 meters with a javelin threw the Schoengen spear replica 77 meters. Now, the book he cites I couldn't get. You say, why not? Because it was written in German. And Craig speaks German fluently. He speaks everything. The guy's just a brain, okay? He speaks German fluently. So he's got this book, and he says, check out this book. No, I don't know any German. Look at the title. I couldn't look it up. But I'm taking his word for it, that they replicated these spears, and they're able to throw them like Olympic javelins. Here is a replica of the Schoengen spear. It's weighted on the front third of the spear, like an Olympic javelin. It's carved out of wood that took work, that took tools to be able to carve this precisely, to have it weighted, to not break, to pick the right kind of wood, and then be able to use this for what? Going hiking? This would be for big game hunting. Now, at this site, they didn't find any evidence that this was used to kill all of these butchered horses that were in the area. A bunch of horses were found, and they were butchered, they were eaten, but there wasn't any evidence that they were stabbed to death. It seems like they were dead. But the argument is that these spears were used for big game hunting. 77 meters, that's incredible. Let me play the skeptic, because I'm trying to play both sides here. How accurate are the replicas? That's what I would want to know. How accurate are these replicas? When you're looking at this is the actual spear. Now, don't look at that and kind of scoff and say, oh, that spear is crooked. It is crooked. It's terribly crooked. It's 400,000 years old, and it's organic material. That stuff doesn't stay fossilized. So this thing was definitely bent. How straight was it? To say that it's perfectly balanced and 1/3 of the front is front weighted, and it's 500 grams and 6 feet, and you can use this like an Olympic javelin. I don't know. If this is the best evidence for Homo heidelbergensis, I think it's very, very interesting. I'm open to it. I'm just trying to play the other side and say it isn't a slam dunk case. All right. Could this be Adam? If Homo heidelbergensis is Adam, this would solve a big issue. Why do we have Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and Denisovans? That there's these two separate species that many like to lump into one species. So for the splitters, they would say, no, Neanderthals are different from Homo sapiens. The lumpers would say, no, they're the same species, and presumably Denisovans. Now, they're genetically distinct, right? But they would say, no, they're the same in the same human family. If you say that Homo heidelbergensis is an image bearer of God, that's where Adam originated, 600,000, 700,000 years ago, you would have no problem with Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans being separate species, because they would all be one race. They would be one human species, because these come from Homo heidelbergensis. So that would be a really good positive of this view. Another positive is that there is good evidence for being made in the image of God. I'll give that to this view. I think there is good evidence. The Acheulean hand axe, the Schoengen spears, the grindstones, that's good evidence. Sure. Negatives of this view. How far back can we push the gaps in the genealogies? Can we go back to, Greg says, 750,000 to 1 million years ago? Again, this is running into that issue we saw with Homo erectus, is that if you go back that far, do you feel comfortable with the antiquity of Adam, that he could be that old? Again, personally, I think I'm a little bit more liberal on this. Other people say, well, he couldn't have been beyond 50,000 years or 100,000 years or 200,000 years. And I know what they mean, because, the gaps in the genealogies aren't thousands of years long. At the same time, a gap is a gap. So if you're to say, well, yeah, they had gaps in the biblical genealogies, Ezra 6 and Genesis 5 and Genesis 10, and even in the time of Jesus, there's gaps in the genealogies, but they can't be that long. My question is, how do you know that? How do you know they can't be thousands of years long? So if there's gaps in the genealogies, it depends. How comfortable do you feel with several 100,000 years of gaps? Some people look at that and they say, not a chance. Other people say, I'm comfortable with that, as long as we get back to an original human pair. And heidelbergensis would give you that. Another issue with heidelbergensis is that it describes the Neolithic period in Genesis 4. Again, there's problems there. How comfortable do you feel with the idea that Genesis 4 describes 10,000 years ago to the present, rather than describing Acheulean hand axes and a period of time that for hundreds of thousands of years, there was no agriculture, there was no animal husbandry, there was no shepherding, there was none of that that's described in Genesis 4. How comfortable do you feel with that? Could there have been societies that did primitive forms of agriculture, and then it was lost to history, and then it was rediscovered later? I mean, there's a number of different ways you can maneuver. The difficulty here is, are you comfortable going back that far? Personally, I am not. I do not feel comfortable going back that far. However, here's what I like. I like having good fallback positions. That if we're running and saying, well, it's got to be 50,000 years ago, it's got to be 100,000 years ago, it's got to be 30,000 years ago, and then we discover, no, it isn't. That I like to be able to have a fallback position that says, if we go back to Homo heidelbergensis, we have the positives that there's signs of being made in the image of God, and this is deep time. This is going back real far. And, I forgot the most important positive. Okay? Ann Gager, Josh Swamidas, Richard Buggs, they said once you get past 500,000 years, there is no way, one way or the other, to say that we came from a population of 10,000 or 2. Can't believe I forgot that. That's the sexiest point about Homo heidelbergensis, is that this is a great fallback position. Why? Because the genetic data show that once you get back to 500,000 years ago, there is no way to discern one way or the other, and that would be an excellent positive. So please write that down. Okay, I don't like this particular view. Maybe you do, but at least we're saying we came from a single pair. Are you with me? What about Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthals? They get their name from being discovered in the Neander Valley. If we were to put this on our timeline here, the phylogenetic tree, they would come in at about 430,000 years ago. And they last until about 40,000 years ago. So they precede Homo sapiens, but they lived concurrently with Homo sapiens. If we were to put this on a map, the Neanderthals were mostly in Europe. So if Homo heidelbergensis was Adam, Homo sapiens went south into Africa, Neanderthals went north into Europe, and they really didn't touch. They stayed separate for tens of thousands of years until they did some touching later. We'll talk about that in a minute. The date, 430,000 years to 40,000 years ago. Brain size, 1,450 cubic centimeters. 1,450 cubic centimeters. Modern day crania are 1,400 cubic centimeters. But Neanderthals had a different development of the brain. I really don't want to go down this rabbit trail, but you can see a Neanderthal is on the left and a Homo sapien is on the right. The way that there was what's called globularization in human brains, and parts were developed that were not developed in Neanderthals, could point to the same volume, but it isn't the volume that we should look at. It's the shape and the morphology and the structure of the brain that matters. So don't just say, well, they had the same brains. They had the same volume of brains. We also were the same volume in our human stature. But how much does that count for being made in the image of God? Their physical size, these guys were tanks. 5'1" to 5'6" is the range, and we have lots of Neanderthal fossils. Last I counted, it was 30 full Neanderthal fossils. I'm sure there's more. That's just the last time I ever studied it, okay? So we've got lots of Neanderthal fossils. They're 5-footers to 5'6". So picture Muggsy Bogues, to make a reference from the NBA 25 years ago. And they're somewhere between 120 to 175 pounds. So short and thick, 20% wider than humans. Tough. I mean, I watched a multi-series documentary on Neanderthals, and they described what it would look like for a UFC fighter to fight a Neanderthal. I don't know if that was true or not, but it was fun to watch. It was so much fun to see finally the UFC fighter wins, in case you're really wondering what happened. He throws sand in the Neanderthal's face, and he's like, and then he kills him and whatever. Anyways, it was really interesting. All right. Is there evidence for Neanderthals being made in the image of God? Now we're really starting to get serious. Neanderthals coexisted with humans. Is there evidence that they bear the image of God? Well, there's evidence that they performed weaving. This would mean that they're able to create things like ropes, things like blankets, things like clothing, that there's evidence of weaving that they could sew. The rebuttal to this finding in 2020 from Hardy et al. Is that the example of weaving was from a 6-millimeter thread. 6-millimeter thread, and the knot was 1 millimeter. This find supposes that, well, of course, Neanderthals can weave, that shows intelligence. Wait a minute, birds weave nests. Elaborate, beautiful. Birds, certain crows, can create hooks. They can create hooks. So weaving, I don't think, is that strong. And when they looked at this fibrous material, this came from the inner bark of a tree. And when this is pulled away, thermodynamics, natural processes, can create interweaving with this fibrous material, where it would be indistinguishable between what was found by Hardy and what's found in the inner bark of trees. Now, let me say before I go too far, I'm indebted to the work of Reasons to Believe for all of this data, okay? Hugh Ross, Vizel Rana, they're the ones who are in the front lines of this, and they're saying, no, Neanderthals were not made in the image of God. So I just want to give credit where credit's due. All right. Second, weaving. What about clothing? Neanderthals lived up in Europe. How did they survive? We're talking about during the Ice Age. 70,000 years ago is when it gets at the worst. Then we have massive flooding. After the Ice Age, the sea levels went up 300 feet, 400 feet, and they're up in the coldest parts. You're telling me they did that naked? No, I'm not telling you that. I'm saying there's no physical evidence that Neanderthal clothing was sewn together. We don't have a single example from archaeology of a Neanderthal rope or a Neanderthal poncho that was sewn together. What we do have are flaps of animal skin that were wrapped around the Neanderthal, but nothing that was sewn, nothing that was put together in any kind of sophisticated way. So clothing, that seems to be a conspicuous omission. What about jewelry? Jewelry. They found perforated marine shells in Spain. And red ochre. Red ochre is a mineral that is used to paint, and you'll see it in some of the later cave paintings that I'm going to show you. But they found this, and they said, this must be jewelry. They found these marine shells with these certain indentations, and they said that is Neanderthal jewelry. The testing for this, they used uranium, thorium testing, luminescent testing. That has been shown to be very, very difficult to discern. That's a polite way of putting it. That type of testing is wacky. They can't figure out, is it 100,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago? They come up with all sorts of different data from uranium, thorium testing to date. However, when you use carbon-14 testing on these pieces of so-called jewelry, it gets you to around 50 to 45,000 years ago. And Homo sapiens had already entered Europe at this point. So they're sure it's Neanderthal jewelry, but Homo sapiens were living there at the time. Now this is in Spain, but we already have graves in France of Homo sapiens that are around this time. So they are in Spain, they're in France, and it could be Homo sapiens, it could be Neanderthals. Furthermore, this ochre is all over Spain, and the mollusks in this area create identical markings on these marine shells. So you're looking at this jewelry. Now, I didn't look at this paper. I haven't actually dug that deep into this. But the very fact that you can look at a piece of jewelry and you're not sure if a mollusk created it or a human created it, I think at the very least shows this is not strong evidence. This is weak evidence. And the fact that Homo sapiens were there. And let me point something else out. Okay, so we don't have any signs of jewelry from Neanderthals from 430,000 years ago until the very brink of their extinction. And then at about 45,000 years ago, just 10,000 years before they're gone, or 5,000 years, then all of a sudden we get jewelry? Then all of a sudden they're able to do this? Or is it that Homo sapiens were there? All right. Sermonette over. Use of fire. They found microliths. Remember lithos, stone. Microliths and flint stones, flint rocks, flint. Hitting it together in order to create a spark, to use fire, and to harness fire to cook. Once you're able to cook, your caloric intake just shoots through the roof. And chewing. You ever tried to chew on a really rare piece of steak? Oh man, it just turns into a piece of bubble gum. You're just chewing on that steak. Well, imagine if it's just blood rare, like you can't cook it at all. Well, you have to masticate on that. Today, studies of chimpanzees and other animals, they have to chew 4.5 hours a day. Just think about the jaw you would have, right? Superman-like jaw. Well, for humans, we chew 20 to 30 minutes a day. Unless you're in the Queen's Castle and you got to chew 30 times for every bite. I mean, those people chew a little bit longer. But for humans, if you can cook the meat, you don't really need to do that at all. But if they had fire and they could use it to cook, all right, these perforations on these flint rocks are evidence that they struck them together to create fire. Here's the real issue. Chimps use fire. Chimpanzees use fire. There's nothing special about using fire. The question is, could you harness fire for an intentional purpose? So, the idea of using a flint rock, that's good evidence. That is good evidence that you're using this intentionally with the purpose. You know how hard it is to start a fire out in the wild? I go out there and start a fire with all the city boys in my group, and they get out there. We've got good wood, it's split, it's cured, we got sticks, twigs, it's all dried, and we've even got a lighter, and they still can't do it, okay? So for me, if I was to actually start a fire with a flint rock, I don't know if I could do that. So here we've got an example of flint rocks being used. That would be some good evidence. Here's the rejoinder. The places where they found these, and only the places, are in warm climates. There's a lot of different space in Europe, north to south. So going from the northern parts of Europe, they don't find any of this. The parts where it would be cold, they don't have these flint rocks or anything where they could harness fire. They do have evidence of fire use in Neanderthals. But do they have evidence of harnessing fire or intentionally using it? Well, the evidence is that it's these perforations in flint rocks, but they're only in the lower parts. These could be used to butcher animals. Flint rock, very good for not carrying germs. That's why the Israelites circumcised their young with a flint rock, because it doesn't carry germs on the inside. So they could have used these to butcher. We don't know what those perforations were for. Use of fire. What about medicine? Again, the idea that they use medicine. Chimps use medicine. Chimps. There's certain plants like this syrup of epipac. I remember having to take that as a kid. I can't remember what I drank, something poisonous probably. And I had to drink the syrup of you puke everywhere instantly. Chimps know that there's certain plants, leaves, that if you eat them, it creates vomiting to get rid of parasites. Now, aren't you glad we studied animal cognition a couple weeks ago? Did they know that there's an abstract connection between parasites and the leaf, or is it a perception that they feel sick and they reach for this thing? Okay, I don't know. I'm not going there. I'm just saying chimps use plants for medicinal purposes. And they use plants for insect repellent. It's pretty amazing. I guess what I'm saying here is to place all of your eggs in this basket, that they use medicine, and that's a sign of the image of God. A cumulative case is only as good as each individual part. If each individual part is not that strong, then I don't think that the cumulative case is strong. What about tools and weapons? There's example of composite tools where Neanderthals were able to create spears. So Australian spearheads, chip off the sides, make a spearhead. And then you put that on top of a spear and you connect it with birch bark tar. So you put those together, fix them. It's like a glue, an adhesive. And then these were wrapped around. We found these different tools, weapons. So big game hunting, coordination. This would be a good evidence for some intelligence. I don't know how much, but that's good evidence. All right, birch bark tar created naturally. It's when a tree burns. You've probably been out in the wilderness. You see the tar, coming out of a tree. When a tree burns, it drips. You can literally see a faucet, albeit very tiny, of birch bark tar, this adhesive dripping down. Then you would touch it. Oh, it's tacky, sticky. Then it hardens. Oh, it's like super glue. Okay, so this occurs naturally. And so we read from Patrick Schmidt. He says this, quote, "The presence of birch tar alone cannot indicate the presence of modern cognition and or cultural behaviors in Neanderthals." So, I don't know. Fixing the stick to the Australian spearhead with the tar, wrapping it, I don't know. I guess it's good. How much complexity, how much symbolism, forethought does that take? All right, what about burial of the dead? Neanderthals buried their dead, and they had ritual. They believed in life after death. They had flowers in some of these tombs. This has been exaggerated. And again, there's a lot of interpretation. So you go into a cave, you find a bunch of Neanderthals that are buried. This is with, I believe, Homo naledi. That's one of the recent finds where they go into a cave and they find a bunch of dead hominins in there. What does it mean? Well, in cave after cave, you find Neanderthal bodies, and there's not flowers, but there's pollen. And they're laid in there, but what does it mean when you see a cave that is rocks on top of the bodies and there's pollen inside the bodies and in the rocks? Does that mean that they were buried? And if they were buried, what does the burial mean? Does it mean that we want to commit their body to the resurrection of the dead when Jesus returns? Or does it mean that we don't want predators to smell the rotting corpse? I don't know. Or is it natural causes that they put these bodies in a cave and there's evidence that the caves collapsed? And you say, well, what about the pollen? They've shown this in models. Wind bringing in pollen. Pollen moves. Pollen is very light, gets shot in through the wind, and there is evidence of pollen, not evidence of flowers. And mice, rats, they can bring in pollen as well. So that's a difficulty. Finally, chimps. I don't know if you've seen the studies on this. Chimpanzee mothers will carry their dead infant up to 19 days, 60 days. Carry them around with them. Now, how do you interpret that? This says carrying around their dead infants. Does it refer to mourning? Do they understand the abstraction that my child is dead, or what dead means? There was a case of a dog that used to go to the train station where his master was going to return. And they said, the dog. The dog is going to the train station because he thinks his master is going to return. And his master died. But he went there every day, day after day after day. And they said, that dog loved his master. I hate to be a cynic and ruin the hallmark moment, but is it that the dog just thought, my master's coming home today? Oh, it's going to be at the train, and goes to the same spot every day. Or is it that he's longing and mourning over the loss and death of his master? I don't know if there's enough data for us to adjudicate between those two possibilities, or maybe 12 different others as to why he's doing that. Same thing is true here. Do chimps understand death and what that means? I definitely believe they feel pain. I believe that they feel emotion. You look at your dog, definitely is happy when you come home. Again, we run the risk of anthropomorphic or anthropopathic, putting human pathos, human emotion, into an animal. We run that risk and assuming that's what they're feeling, when in reality, they're not. All I'm saying here is the same behavior in Neanderthals, if they were burying their dead, is also found in a similar way in chimpanzees. There was one video of the chimp, I believe it was a chimp, Pansy, Pansy. And when she died in the zoo, all of the other chimps lined up along the fence and stared at her dead body for days. What does it mean? I don't know. At this point, I'm not trying to talk about animal cognition too much. I'm just trying to point out that here we have an example where burial of the dead, natural causes, ? Or what does it mean that they buried their dead? Finally, technology of Neanderthals. Technology. Here is where I find to be the strongest evidence against Neanderthals being made in the image of God. Ready? For 400,000 years, Neanderthal technology did not improve at all. Are still using the same Acheulean spearheads. They're still using the same wraps around themselves. They're still, and we're striving to find clothing. Is there any clothing? Are there any ropes? Are there any tents? Anything that we have? No, it stays completely static for almost 500,000 years, and then they die out. All right, here's Ian Tattersall. He says this: all claimed evidence for symbolic activities among Neanderthals is highly debatable. Currently, there is little compelling reason to conclude that Homo neanderthalensis was a symbolic creature in the same sense as modern Homo sapiens. Let me give you one example where scientists said, here we have an example of a Neanderthal find. Here, I'll show you.
One of our colleagues said to us, I think he came to Clive, and he said, have a look at this. We've had to cover it up to protect it, but we did take a lot of photographs, and we've got a 3D printer that we can show you.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So let's just angle it.
They looked pretty nondescript straight lines, except realizing that we were in a Neanderthal level, and the implication was huge.
Somebody has deliberately set down a thought that had been conceptualized in their minds and put it down on the rock. And that is a first.
I've had a lot of correspondence, a lot of suggestions.
Some very way out.
Like what?
Somebody suggested it might be a way of mathematics, doing multiplications.
Maybe it's constellations. It's a place where the cave crisscrosses. Is it a map of the cave? Maybe it's a mark of a clan. That some people have suggested that as well.
You had a very good suggestion.
Well, I had one suggestion from one that impressed me. And that person wrote to me and said, have you realized that that mark we all have?
It's intriguing to imagine that this hashtag could represent the lifelines on a Neanderthal's palm, and that this could be amongst the world's oldest art.
That is among the world's oldest art. What is it? Tell me what it is. What is it? It's symbolic, yeah, of what? Well, it could be a map of the cave. It could be the constellations. It could be the marks on your hands. They're two perpendicular lines. And this is what we're saying is Neanderthal. This is one of the bigger ones. I mean, I watched a 2-part documentary on it, and this is one of the best things they said. Wait until we get to the cave paintings and compare it with what we just saw right there. All right, what about the subject that nobody wants to talk about, which is Neanderthal interbreeding with humans? Ever since 2010, a little bit earlier, but 2010, it really hit the scene that they had sequenced the Neanderthal genome. And what they had done was drilled Neanderthal bones and pulled out splices. We're talking 50 to 100 base pairs of Neanderthal DNA, and eventually put together an entire map of the genome for Neanderthals. Then later, so that was the first time through in 2010. In 2013, they had a 52-fold coverage. As I've talked about before, if you're purifying gold, you heat up the gold to a liquid state, and then you clear off the dross. That's once. Then you let it settle. Then you heat it up again, clear off the remaining dross. That's 2, 3, 4, 5. The word of the Lord is purified 7 times, right? Proverbs 12. Same thing is true here, only in the sense of genomics. They went through and had a 52-fold coverage. And they got the genome down really well from ancient DNA. So, what did they find? Most humans have 1.5 to 2.1% Neanderthal DNA. So that means that something happened in our past which shows that we interbred with Neanderthals. Now, those who are in sub-Saharan African, if you have sub-Saharan African descent, you have 0% Neanderthal DNA. Because your great, 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 generations back, they never interbred with Neanderthals. They stayed in Africa. But Europeans have 1.5 to 2.1% Neanderthal DNA. You could do the 23andMe. You can see this. This is pretty much well accepted at this point, which reminds me of that Maury Povich episode. Wow, this is awkward. To discover that your great, somebody in your genome in the history was a Neanderthal. Man. All right, what do we do with this? For one, humans didn't evolve from Neanderthals. That's not what this evidence shows. This does not, nobody is arguing that humans came from Neanderthals. So let me put that differently. Neanderthals go back to 430,000 years ago, humans to 200,000 years ago. But they were separate, isolated species for thousands of years. They're distinct from one another, and if they came from Homo heidelbergensis, they split apart. Why did they split apart? Xenophobia, racism, maybe one of them could talk and the other couldn't. Tribalism, I don't know, but Neanderthals went one way into Europe, Homo sapiens stayed in Africa. But at a certain point, roughly around 60,000 years ago, humans left Africa and encountered Neanderthals. So what we're talking about here is interbreeding between species, not the evolution of Homo sapiens from Neanderthals. Now, how do we explain this? Many species interbreed. And you say, no, they interbreed, but they have infertile offspring. That is not true. There are some species that interbreed that produce infertile offspring. So you can have 2 animals come together, copulate, produce a baby, but that baby can't produce another mixture, a liger or whatever. You can't go on from there into creating another generation. However, it is the case that many species can interbreed with one another and produce fertile offspring. Which species? There are 6 distinct baboon species. And these 6 distinct species all interbreed with each other. There are gray wolves, dogs, and golden jackals. Very different types of canines in that entire genus. And yet they are able to interbreed and have fertile offspring successfully. Most interesting to me are the extinct cave bears and living brown bears. Now, cave bears went extinct about 25,000 years ago. But if you look in the genome of the living brown bear, guess what you find? 2% cave bear. It's almost a perfect analog for what we're talking about here. That if a brown bear could talk outside of children's stories, if you talk to a brown bear and you said, your great ancestor was actually one of those stinking cave bears, I'm sure the brown bear would say, oh, you're kidding me. I can't believe we had interbreeding. Yes, you had interbreeding. 16% of the avian population, birds, can interbreed with each other. 16%. So this whole idea of interbreeding with one another, you can't produce fertile offspring, that's not true. That's simply not true. Now, all that is to say, it takes millions of years for full reproductive isolation to develop. Sometimes something that clearly had not yet occurred for Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens. So, Chris Stringer, it may take millions of years for full reproductive isolation to develop. That is to say, when you have Neanderthals and Homo sapiens living side by side for 200,000 years, to actually have them be so distinct as species that they could no longer interbreed with one another, that could take millions of years, something that had not occurred for these two species. Now, Chris Stringer is one of those who says, brilliant paleoanthropologist, one of the Natural Museum's curator. He's one of those who says, no, we're not the same species. We're distinct. We're separate. So he's saying, yeah, there was interbreeding, but Neanderthals were definitely different. What does all this mean? It happened, but that doesn't make it good. So when we look at this and we say, well, I got some genetic mutations that lead to chronic illness in my life, and this came from 10,000 years ago. Does that make that good? No. When we say that there's retroviruses in my body, when we say that there are all these different things that happen to my genome, mutations, and so forth, that doesn't make it good. The same is true with interbreeding with Neanderthals. On the view that Neanderthals are not made in the image of God, this would be akin to bestiality, something without a soul mating. Now, you might say, how could that even happen? Why is it in Leviticus 18:23 it says, you shall not lie with an animal? It does happen. It happens a lot. And it shouldn't. It's gross. And apparently it happened when humans encountered Neanderthals. If, like me, you hold to the view that the Nephilim were creations of human women and demons, and if you don't agree with me on that, I've got the arguments for you, but that's just not our topic. Hypothetically, even if you don't agree with that interpretation, then you believe that humans did interbreed with something alien to the human species, whether that's a demon, whether that's a Neanderthal, or whatever. That doesn't mean that it's good. In fact, in Genesis 6, God brings a flood and wipes all of this out because he was so enraged by it. Now, that's when demons have sex with human women. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, God apparently didn't feel the need to wipe us out. Has it hurt us? No. Some of these mutations or parts of the genome are actually beneficial because you're getting into different species that lived in different areas, and some of them are deleterious. Some of them are harmful. They're not good for us. But whatever the case, just because there's interbreeding, that doesn't make it good. All that is to say, when you say that there was interbreeding, what does that demonstrate? What does it demonstrate? It doesn't demonstrate that we have a common ancestor. It demonstrates that ancient people were having sex with Neanderthals. That's all it demonstrates. All right, what about, I've been hard on the Neanderthals. Could this be Adam? Could this be Adam? Positives. There's some good evidence for the image of God. We could go through, and I mean, most scientists would say, no, we think that Neanderthals were very similar to humans, and there's a big debate as to whether actually the lumpers and the splitters are going to win. They would say, no, they actually should be united with humans. If you saw a Neanderthal walking down the street today, you wouldn't even recognize him. 5'3", big brow, protruding. No, I think you would recognize him. I don't buy that for a second. But regardless, I think there is some evidence. There's some evidence. Can't get around that. But it's debatable. I guess that's my point. Now, if Neanderthals are made in the image of God, this whole interbreeding problem is not a problem because we're one race. So, you really would have no issue at all. Why did we interbreed with Neanderthals? Somebody might say, because Neanderthals were humans, made in the image of God. But they were so different. Of course they were different, but they're still in the same, they still bear the image of God. They might have different genes, they're distinct, but at least similar enough that we could interbreed and have procreation with them. Negatives is, since we didn't evolve from Neanderthals, which everyone agrees on, this effectively puts us back to Homo heidelbergensis. So if you say, well, I think Neanderthals were human, then what you're saying is that you believe that Homo heidelbergensis was Adam. Remember? Because Homo heidelbergensis splits into neanderthalensis and sapiens. So really this view is not any different than Homo heidelbergensis. So all that is to say, sorry, I went too quick, didn't I? How do you go back? There you go. All this is to say, all of the assessment we did with Homo heidelbergensis would apply here as well, which is that if you believe that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are the same species, that takes you a direct line right back to Homo heidelbergensis. All right, what about Homo sapiens? Are they Adam? I hope so. I hope at least we've gotten to some point where we're sure. Homo means human and sapien means wise human. Again, if we get our phylogenetic evolutionary tree here, we would be at about 200,000 years ago. We would be living alongside of Neanderthals. And again, you can see the split from heidelbergensis to neanderthalensis and sapiens. If we looked at a map, you could go back as far as 300,000. We're going to discuss that momentarily. But somewhere around 150 to 200,000 years ago is where you would place humans, Homo sapiens. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to use the word human because it's so backloaded with meaning. Because if we say Neanderthals are human, or heidelbergensis is human, or Homo sapiens are human, that's the very thing that we're trying to figure out. Erectus is human. Okay, so I'm trying not to use that word human, but Homo sapiens, everyone would agree, at least Homo sapiens are human. Okay. We spread out everywhere, all the way down into Australia, up into Europe, Central Asia, and eventually into the Bering Strait, crossed over 15,000 years ago into North America. I've heard some estimates as low as 70. 70 made the trek into North America, made their way all the way down to the tip of South America. I mean, it's incredible the way that Homo sapiens have been able to spread across the globe. Nothing like what we've seen before. What about Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit? That's not a pejorative term. That's the term used in the media. Maybe the media was being pejorative, or were being pejorative. I don't know. But anyways, they called them hobbits. Why would they call them hobbits? Because they had a brain size of 400 cubic centimeters. That is on par with a chimpanzee. A chimpanzee would have a cranial capacity of roughly 400 cubic centimeters. They had a physical size of 3'7" and 55 pounds. It would be like picking up one of your kids, little kids. And they lived somewhere between 100,000 years ago to 60,000 years ago. This is some kind of an offshoot of Homo sapiens. I don't really know what to do with this. Was it a separate species? Was it because they lived in Australia and really down in Indonesia and the area of Java? Did they get isolated, get into interbreeding, and this turned into some kind of mutation that led to terrible difficulties for this group of people? So they're late in the game. They could have come off of Homo sapiens, but the amount of mutation and problems really led to a quick appearance and a quick disappearance. If I had to guess, this is some kind of a mutation off of humans that never flourished and probably had severe, severe handicaps. All right, Homo sapiens, the date. Some would put this as far back as 300,000 years ago. Jabal Irhoud is one of the sites in which they found in Morocco bones of Homo sapiens. And they used the thermal luminescence dating method to date these bones to 300,000 years ago. Again, this method is fraught with difficulty. So a more conservative estimate for Homo sapiens would be around 200 to 150,000 years ago. Chris Stringer, he's the emeritus curator at Natural History Museum. He points to the earliest fossils being at Homo Kibish. And he says they date somewhere 200,000 or less. Brain size, anywhere from 1,000 cubic centimeters to 2,000 cubic centimeters. Again, they have the globularization of the brain. The brain functions and is created differently. Evidence for the image of God. Homo sapiens advanced to all regions on planet Earth. Which reminds me of what we read in Genesis 11. That when humans came together to the Tower of Babel, they were spread out and they spread fast. They were separated by language and they just went to the four corners of the earth. Now, how much of Genesis 11 is referring to the author's perspective? I mean, if you look at the genealogy, it's tedious. But if you study, well, this group and this descendant went to this island and this place and that place. When you get it all down to the brass tacks, you realize it's not far from Israel. It's all in the purview of Israel. So that could just be describing an initial or imminent spreading of humans. However, Homo sapiens spread across the entire planet Earth, every ecosystem, every continent, everywhere. There was a cultural Big Bang anywhere between 60 and 40,000 years ago due to a, quote, fortuitous mutation in the brain. I love that. Fortuitous mutation. So what is that saying? We don't know. There must have been some mutation in the brain that all of a sudden you've got things like complex culture, cave paintings, music, weaponry that is totally advanced and sophisticated, clear ritualistic burial of the dead. We could go on and on about this, but I'm sure you've seen this in your anthropology courses, that once we get to 50,000 years ago, all of a sudden, boom, you've got a big outspread of human culture and intelligence and cognition. This would be clear signs of the image of God. Look at this painting. This is from 17,000 years ago. Look at the detail. This was before paintbrushes. This was before paint. They were using ochre and mineral like somebody in a prison cell, scrapping on the wall. And they were able to show incredible detail. Another painting goes back to France 32,000 years ago. And if you could zoom in and really look at that, what you see is incredible detail. I would wager, if I asked any of you to pull out a pen and paper and to draw something this beautiful, you couldn't do it. You couldn't do it. I could. I know how to draw, but you couldn't, okay? I mean, this is absolutely beautiful. Then we go back 44,000 years. Look at the stencil of the hand right next to the, I don't know what animal that is, some kind of a deer or something or other. But look at, they've got even the hair drawn on the animal, the legs, the horns, and the hand is reaching out toward the animal. Just breathtaking, these images. That goes back 44,000 years. So we also see burial of the dead 30,000 years ago. This is found in Russia, where they found two children buried in the ground. They were put head to head with their hands placed over their pelvises. Just think about that. Hands are placed over their pelvises. And that stayed there for 30,000 years. And they covered this with that red ochre, that mineral ore. But not just that. 250 fox teeth, 5,000 ivory beads. And this was estimated to create that many ivory beads and fox teeth, 2,500 hours to bury in the ground. So I'm reminded of reading G.K. Chesterton's book. I believe it's The Everlasting Man. And this was back in the 1920s when Darwinism hadn't even reached neo-Darwinism yet, but it was on the rise. And Chesterton was just a literary mind and a brilliant man in his own right, but he didn't know the science. But what he did know was common sense. And I remember in that book, Chesterton said that today the scientists are telling us that our ancestors were these brutes that would grab their club and throw their hide over their shoulder and go out and club a woman and then throw her over her shoulder and take her back to the cave and do whatever. We don't know how to describe that whole scene. Okay, and he's like, and that's what we were. That's what we came from. We're these cavemen, Cro-Magnon men. And he said, but what evidence do we have from the past about what humans were like? We don't have evidence of clubbing the woman over the head and speaking in goo goo gaga and speaking as cavemen and stuff like that. What we know about them are two things, says Chesterton. We know that they liked to paint. And we know that they buried their dead and loved their dead. This whole picture that the cavemen and the brutes from the past, the whole idea of an Adam and Eve is just so incongruous with the idea of ancient man needs to go. Because what we have here is a picture of people just like us. In many ways, smarter. You say, well, we're more educated, of course. Of course we're more educated. They were more ignorant, of course. But they were able to start fire. Can you do that? They were able to harness weaponry and to kill for their own meals. I mean, if we went back to this time period, we would have mass extinction of people on Earth. All right, evaluation. Could this be Adam? If you go back to the longest time frame for Adam, that would put him at 200,000 years ago, which I put that as a plus because that's way closer than any other species we've studied. The bottlenecks, though, there's many that occurred in the last 200,000 years. So that could mean that God could have come in and intervened into the human race sometime between 200,000 years ago and roughly 70,000 years ago. And you say, what do you mean by that? There's a view that has long been discarded by academics, but used to be considered the standard view. It's referred to as the ruin reconstruction theory, or what's commonly been called the gap theory. This theory holds that in Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. How much time transpired between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2? How many days transpired? It doesn't say. Days aren't even invented yet in Genesis 1:2. All we have is that the earth is formless and void. And then God comes in and he creates. He creates the animals and he creates the plants and he creates this all under the gap theory could be a local event. But God comes in, recreates the original pair, and then from there moves forward into biblical history. Now you say, wait a minute, so there was Homo sapiens before Adam and Eve? Yes, and they all died off. Were they made in the image of God? No. Are we related to them? Not on the gap theory view, no. They died off, a ruin restoration view. So if God let those primates, Homo sapiens, die off, and then intervened sometime 70, 60,000 years ago, we could have an original pair and we would never know it. Now, why don't I say 10,000 years ago? Because humans made it all across the earth into North America by 10,000 years ago. Because humans have Neanderthal DNA in them, and guess when they got that? When they entered Africa 70,000 years ago, approximately. So the gap theory, you couldn't put that post 70,000 years because you've already got Neanderthal DNA. unless God recreated the humans with Neanderthal DNA. I don't know why he would do that. But it's got to be pre-70 or 60, but that would seem to fit pretty well with what we're seeing here. Now again, you're saying there was primates. There were Homo sapiens from 200,000 years ago to 70,000 years ago. So what? They didn't have souls? Well, look, this would be the same picture that we see with all of the hominins. These could be creatures, they could be hominins, but we don't know what they were capable of. Under the gap theory view, the reason that it's attractive is basically you can say, I don't know what happened before this. But at that point, God came into history, and that would fit really well with this cultural explosion that we see at about 70, 60, 50,000 years ago. All right, if you don't buy that, there's tons of views. All right, plenty of views. You could go back as far as 200,000 years ago. I guess I'm just trying to give us some options here. Clear evidence of being made in the image of God. I don't know how you can look at those cave paintings and say, no, that's pre-Neolithic. 17,000, 32,000, 44,000. You're telling me those people weren't human? Of course they were human. I've never seen a monkey do something like that, have a cave painting like that, bury their dead like that. Those were definitely humans. So that would create a nice window where we've got the image of God very clearly. And at most, it would go back 200,000 years for Adam. The negative would be that this is excluding antecedent humans, Neanderthals and heidelbergensis. But that is circular reasoning. You're assuming that Neanderthals are made in the image of God. You're assuming heidelbergensis is made in the image of God. Have you proved that, though? If we're excluding Neanderthals and Heidelberg man, and you're saying, well, you're excluding humans, yeah, wait a minute, how do you know that they were human? Now, I know William Lane Craig will say, we should not exclude people made in the image of God, and they show signs of this, and they're abstract thinking and so forth. Okay, but that's the part that we're debating. Are there signs in Heidelberg, man, are there signs in Neanderthals that show the image of God? If there aren't, then this is not a negative. This just shows that there were primates that lived on Earth that had some level of intelligence, but weren't ensouled, they weren't soulish beings in the image of God. This view, you still have gaps in the genealogies. Unless you're a young Earth creationist, you're going to have gaps in the genealogies. Wait, even if you're a young Earth creationist, you're going to have gaps in the genealogies. Because you're putting, most young Earth creationists would not put Adam at 6,000 years ago. They would put Adam all the way back at 10,000 years ago. But if you add up the genealogies, it gets you to 6,000 years ago. So they're adding another 4,000 years. And most young Earth creationists will say, well, yeah, there's some gaps in there. A gap is a gap is a gap. Once you admit there's gaps that could include thousands of years, I see no reason why it couldn't go way further. I don't get that. I really don't get the thinking on that. If there's a gap, there's a gap. And for you to say, well, it could be 4,000 years, but not 4,001 years. Or it could be 4,000 years extra of gaps, but not 5,000 or 6,000 or 10,000. How do you know that? That's what I want to know. How do you know the gaps could allow for 4,000 years, but not 10,000, 20,000, 200,000? Finally, the Genesis 4 Neolithic description wouldn't fit with this account. But again, as I've argued, you could have agriculture, you could have shepherding, you could have all of these things that were gained and lost over time. You could also say that these figures in Genesis 4 were the father of metallurgy, animal husbandry, agriculture, but they're the father in the sense that they're the progenitor. That Abraham is our father, not that he gave birth to me, but that he gave birth to the line that gave birth to animal husbandry, metallurgy, and so forth. If you want to know my view, this is where I land, and specifically I land somewhere in the 70 to 50,000 range. I think that humans could have come on the scene in there. There could have been a bottleneck. There could have been a recreation. I don't know, but it could go back as far as 200,000 years ago. Let me just give you a timeline here of what this looks like. So the origin of Homo sapiens on this view would be 200,000 years ago. Of course, we're living concurrently with Neanderthals that are in Europe. We are in Africa. By the time you get to 70,000 years, you reach the coldest part of the Ice Age. This period is a point where you have extreme bottlenecks. The temperature is at its lowest. It's dropping anywhere from 3 degrees Celsius to 10 degrees Celsius. There's a huge drop where you have a bottleneck at about 70,000 years ago. And again, this lines up with going into Africa. If we enter into Africa, before that happens, you have this bottleneck. If there was a place for a ruin restoration theory, a gap theory, I believe this is where it happened. Because this is where it would have to occur. Before Neanderthal gene introgression, interbreeding, before you get that, but at some point where you get down to a small amount of people. How does this all play out with the biblical flood? It would have to happen before this time as well. Unless you believe in literally a global flood. The water covered the entire globe. Covering the Mount Everest and that sort of thing. If you hold that view, that's going to be very difficult to line up with the science. But if you hold to a universal flood, that's where I lean toward. Universal means that God wiped out all humans. Wiped out all humans. So it's universal in its scope for humanity. He got rid of all humans during the flood. That means that it needs to be that flood needs to be at least big enough to wipe out the human race. But if you wait, if you wait any longer than this, 70,000 years ago, you're going to get humans up into Asia, Europe, Australia. If you wait until 15,000 years ago, you're going to have the flood in North America. So it seems to me this is the place it would have to happen. They have a great leap forward in human culture, creativity, and cognition somewhere between 60 and 40,000 years ago. So leaving Africa, 60,000, and then they're encountering Neanderthals. And boom, all of a sudden you've got cave paintings. Boom, you've got cumulative culture. Boom, abstract thought. Boom, complex weaponry. That is where it happens right here in this window. Once you reach to 50,000 years ago, humans have made it all the way to Australia. I just want to give you an idea of the geographical spread. 50,000 years ago, they make it to Australia. 40,000 years ago, they're in Europe. At least by 40,000 years ago, they're in Europe. At this point, the Neanderthals go out of commission. Why? Was it that humans killed them? Was it that humans were more adept at surviving during an ice age? We're not sure. We don't have remains of Neanderthals. Well, there is some evidence. There's evidence of Neanderthals' rib cages that have perforations. They think that could be the spear. We're not sure. Anyways, regardless, Neanderthals disappear by 40,000 years ago. And humans make it to Europe. Finally, humans make it to Central Asia by 35,000 years ago. You can see the rapidity in which they traveled once you hit that great leap forward at about 70K, 60K. Then, once you reach 15,000 years ago, humans make it all the way up to the Bering Strait, which is, if I had the full map, that would connect over to northern Canada and Alaska, where they come across the Bering Strait. This would be before the end of the Ice Age, before an enormous flood. Water levels rose 300, 400 feet, but humans made it all the way into North America and then down into the southern tip of the Americas. Let's wrap up. How do we put all this together? Well, if I could leave you with just a few thoughts at the end of this course, this is the most important part. I know a lot of that was a lot, but I hope to leave you with some concrete thoughts. Number one, Jesus believed in a historical Adam. There was the story of a biblical scholar who went to a conference. His name was J. Barton Payne. And at the conference of biblical scholars, he ran into another scholar who had just written a book on the commentary on the book of Jonah. And he said, in your commentary, Professor, I noticed that you said that this whole thing was an allegory, that Jonah never lived, and Jonah was really an allegory for Israel, being the reluctant prophet. There was no Nineveh interaction, there was no repent. But wait a minute, Matthew chapter 12 compares the repentance of Nineveh and the Jonah being in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights to Jesus' resurrection. And Jesus believed in Jonah, and Jesus believed in the repentance of the Ninevites. I mean, to say that the Ninevites will stand up on that day and cast judgment on you, it'd be one thing if he was using an allegory, but to say the Ninevites will be there, what if I gave you an illustration? I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here. What if I gave you an illustration where I said, you should turn to God like the thief on the cross? I mean, it's like Return of the Jedi. Darth Vader, at the very end of his life, changes his heart, and that was good enough. And so too, you could change your heart as well. And on the last day, if you don't change your heart, Darth Vader is going to come and cast his judgment against you. Right? That's the argument. Jesus is saying the Ninevites will cast their judgment against you because they repented, but you didn't. So anyways, back to the story. J. Barton Payne says to this biblical scholar, Jesus believed that Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus believed that the Ninevites repented, and that happened. And the scholar famously said, well, Jesus was just a first century Palestinian Jew. I know more than Jesus did. Well, that pretty much says it all right there. When I get to heaven and I see God, I want to be able to say, I held the view that your son held about the historical Adam. And I think it is an exceptional amount of hubris and pride to say, well, I'm going to disagree with what Jesus of Nazareth said about the historical Adam. Do not do that. That is a big, big mistake for your spiritual life, to start disagreeing with Jesus Christ. One other thought I want to leave you with here is, what is the best explanation for humans being made in the image of God? One of the arguments we were making, and this is typically the way I like to teach this, I don't like to get into Homo habilis and erectus and neanderthalensis. I don't like to do that. I don't think it's profitable. What I like to do is say, why are humans so unique? Why are we unlike any other animal? Why do we have a soul? And there's very, very good arguments for that, for a soul. From where does that originate? And what is the best explanation? A fortuitous mutation? That's what it was? That gave us the ability to have abstract reasoning and language and cumulative culture and morality and free will? That's what it was, a fortuitous mutation. So I like to actually ask, right now, we're not looking at Adam, we're not looking at fossil bones. Right now, we're looking at each other. Where did we come from? Again, something I've been trying to emphasize throughout this course is this. It isn't the science that I disagree with. It isn't the fossil bones. It isn't the dates. It isn't that I'm arguing for creation science. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is I agree with the data. The question is, how should the data be interpreted? You come to a scene where there's a crime. And it's 1930. And it's you and your white police commissioner. He shows up to the body, and it's a dead white woman laying there on the ground. She's been raped and murdered. And he turns to you and he says, McTaggart, which is your name, McTaggart, let's go catch this son of a gun who did this to this white woman here. And you say, yes, sir, Commander, I'm going to go get him. But right before you leave, your commissioner says, let's just make sure that whoever we catch is black. Boy, at that point, it would make you wonder, what if the rapist and the killer isn't black? What if you had tons of evidence that it was a white man who did it, and very minimal evidence that it was a black man who did it? Some evidence, but nothing compared to the evidence for the white man who is the suspect. If you come into the discussion, the crime scene, with the racial prejudice the racial presupposition that it must have been a black man who did this, that will completely skew and distort who you put on trial and who goes to jail. Now, why am I bringing this up? If we come to the data of the natural sciences and we say, well, we've got a naturalistic bias, a naturalistic presupposition, and we hold to methodological naturalism, it needs to be a natural cause, then at the end of the day, guess what cause you're going to find 10 times out of 10? A natural cause. It has to be natural. What is the latest common ancestor? It's got to be some kind of a species between the great apes and the hominids. It has to be under naturalism. But if you can look beyond that and say it could be natural, it could also be supernatural. That is where I think we should look at. The interpretation of the science. Much of it comes down to our presuppositions. That when we look at the data could be showing one thing, but depending on your worldview, you're not going to allow God in the door. So, it isn't the science, it's how we interpret the science, and really our philosophy of what science is. Another thing I've been trying to really press home, I hope I've just beat this horse to death, is that we want to have multiple models, not just one. Now, some of those models I gave, you might say, no, I think that's too far. Going back to Homo erectus, that's too far. I get it. But I'm saying if we could hold to an orthodox view of an original pair from whom the entire human race originated, wouldn't that be a good place to be? I don't hold to Homo erectus either, but I'd like to have multiple models. Why? Because then I don't have to sweat every time I read a new journal article where somebody says, well, it's got to be, the 2 articles I read recently said that humans actually went in a first wave into Africa 150,000 years ago, and we gave our mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal DNA to Neanderthals. I don't know what to do with that. But I've got multiple different options. And I think that is what I'm trying to impress upon you. When you get very narrow and say, this is the only way this can be interpreted. This is the only way to find any kind of concord between science and Scripture. That is a dangerous place to be because your faith rests on something that you ultimately don't know. So I hope you can tell I was speaking with my tongue in my cheek when I said 70,000 years ago, that's when humans arose. I'm joking. I'm saying that's my view. But what is it, Wednesday? By Thursday, my view could be different. And on Friday, it could be different still. I'm saying we should have a broad tent under which we can have and hold the scientific data. All right, this is it. 3 more words. I hope you remember these 3 words. I hope years later these are seared into your brain. If you remember nothing about heidelbergensis, globularization, animal cognition, Derek Penn, if you remember nothing else, I hope you remember these 3 words from this class. Wait and see. We would do so well if we didn't jump on every bandwagon that pops up in the natural sciences. Let the scientists figure it out and let the dust settle before you have a total rehabilitation of your faith or you deconstruct your faith over something that is so fleeting. When we're looking at these data, the data are very complex and difficult to understand. And for you to say, well, my faith rests on every wind and wave that happens in the natural sciences, just give it some time. And hold to a big tent view where we've got flexibility as to where we could put the historical atom.